They called me the black sheep. In hushed whispers and loud confrontations, the label was stitched to my name like a permanent scar. I remember sitting at the family table, the air heavy with judgment, every word they spoke a reminder that I was not who they wanted me to be. My cousins were praised for their achievements, my siblings admired for their obedience, while I was the cautionary tale, the one who strayed too far, dreamed too wildly, and refused to conform. At first, it felt like loneliness wrapped around me in chains. The laughter that excluded me, the eyes that rolled at my ideas, the subtle sighs whenever I entered a room. They all reminded me that I was the outsider within my own bloodline. Betrayal didn't come from strangers. It came from those who were supposed to love unconditionally, and perhaps that cut the deepest. But here is what they never understood. Rejection can either break you or forge you. While they branded me with shame, something else was quietly growing inside me, a restless fire that refused to die. Each insult became fuel, each dismissal a spark. I learned to sit in silence, not because I agreed with their verdict, but because I was planning, observing, building. What they mistook as failure was simply foundation. What they saw as recklessness was the courage to step into storms they could never face. They thought they had written my story, closing it with a final judgment: black sheep, lost cause. But I was only on the first page of a much larger book, one that would prove that the very exile they mocked would become the empire they never saw coming. Childhood is supposed to be a season of innocence, a time when love shields you from the harshness of the world. For me, it was the very place where harshness was born. My earliest memories are not of warm embraces or gentle encouragement, but of comparisons that carved deep grooves into my heart. At family gatherings, my siblings' smallest achievements were celebrated as though they were victories for the entire bloodline. A certificate, a prize, a well-spoken answer in school, all were met with applause and pride. When it came to me, silence filled the room. If I stumbled, they sighed. If I succeeded, they dismissed it as luck. Favoritism was never hidden. My parents, perhaps unknowingly, set the tone by holding up my siblings as shining examples. "Why can't you be more like them?" became a refrain that echoed through my childhood like an unwelcome hymn. I remember standing in the living room, holding up a drawing I had poured my heart into. My mother glanced once, forced a smile, then turned to compliment my brother's math test score. That single moment, small as it was, became a mirror of my entire childhood, my passions invisible, my efforts undervalued. Neglect doesn't always look like abandonment. Sometimes it looks like a child calling for attention and receiving only comparisons. Sometimes it looks like being present in a room yet unseen. I was there, woven into the family portrait but emotionally exiled. My voice was a faint echo against walls already filled with the chorus of those deemed worthy. Being branded the outsider wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow, steady branding iron pressed into my identity over the years. Teachers were told, "Don't expect much from this one." Relatives muttered that I was difficult, rebellious, or not like the others. Each word stuck, forming an invisible cage around me. Even in school, I carried the weight of those labels. When I failed, it confirmed their judgment. When I succeeded, they dismissed it as an accident. Yet the scars from this neglect weren't just about being overlooked, they were about being underestimated. I was taught, directly and indirectly, that I would never measure up. My dreams were laughed at before they even had a chance to breathe. I remember once telling an aunt that I wanted to build something of my own one day, perhaps a business, something meaningful. She chuckled and told me to focus on finding stability first, because people like me were not cut out for greatness. At the time, I swallowed her words whole, believing them, but deep down, even as a child, I felt the ember of defiance. Every dismissal, every comparison, every cruel whisper became a bruise on my soul, but also a seed of resilience. I began to notice patterns others ignored. I watched the dynamics of favoritism unfold like a stage play, and slowly, I understood the script. I was cast as the misfit, but I realized that misfits had freedom. If they expected nothing from me, then I could shape my own story without their permission. Still, the pain was real. Nights were long and quiet, filled with the ache of questions no one answered. Why wasn't I enough? Why did love feel conditional? Why did my siblings shine while I was told to stay in the shadows? These questions became the soundtrack of my childhood, and though they hurt, they also sharpened me. I learned to listen, to read emotions, to sense the unspoken. Neglect teaches you to become your own anchor. And so, the black sheep was born, not from rebellion alone, but from the absence of belonging. The emotional scars of being dismissed and underestimated ran deep, but they did not define the entirety of me. Instead, they became the backdrop against which my strength would later emerge. My childhood shadows haunted me, yes, but they also carved space for light to one day break through. Betrayal does not always come in dramatic strokes. Sometimes it arrives in quiet, daily moments that leave invisible scars. For me, betrayal was not about one grand act, but the countless ways my family chose to sideline me, mock me, or erase my existence from the narrative of pride they so eagerly told the world. It was in the subtle cuts of indifference, the laughter that wasn't shared with me, the spotlight that was always turned away whenever I dared to step forward. One of my earliest memories of this came at a school awards ceremony. I had worked tirelessly on a science project that won me third place at the district level. Standing there on stage, clutching my certificate, I searched the audience for my parents. They were there, sitting in the middle row, but their expressions were muted, distracted. When the ceremony ended, they rushed to congratulate my elder brother, who had recently won a small local football match. "He's our star," my father beamed, while my certificate quietly folded in my trembling hands. That night at dinner, the conversation revolved entirely around my brother's victory. No one asked me how I felt or what it meant to stand on that stage. Betrayal began to take shape in those silences. Relatives were no kinder. Family gatherings became battlegrounds of comparison. "Your cousin is so graceful, so accomplished," an aunt once said loudly, making sure I heard her. "And you?" Always lost, always stubborn. I learned to laugh it off, to pretend their words did not pierce me. But inside, I was collecting every insult, every dismissal, storing them like coal to keep a secret fire burning. The worst betrayals, however, came not from distant relatives, but from those closest to me. Siblings, the people who were supposed to be my companions in life, joined the chorus of mockery. They mimicked my voice when I tried to share my opinions, laughed at my mistakes as if they were entertainment, and shut me out of the warmth of their camaraderie. I remember overhearing them once telling friends, "Don't take her seriously. She's the odd one out." Their words, spoken casually, cut deeper than any deliberate insult. I wasn't just excluded. I was ridiculed into invisibility. Parents, too, played their part. Their pride was a currency they spent lavishly on my siblings but never on me. I recall the day I won an inter-school essay competition. I rushed home, certificate in hand, eager to share my triumph. My mother barely looked up from the kitchen, muttering, "That's nice," before returning to her work. Hours later, when my sister entered the house with news that she had been selected for a minor role in a school play, the entire family erupted in celebration. They invited neighbors, boasting about her talent. My certificate remained tucked away in a drawer, unseen, unacknowledged. That night, I cried myself to sleep, not because of the lack of recognition, but because I realized their pride had boundaries, and I was always outside them. As the years went on, the betrayal grew sharper. At family weddings, I was the one asked to run errands, to serve food, to stay in the background while my siblings were dressed up, introduced proudly, and praised for their accomplishments. A cousin once whispered to me, "Why do they treat you like the help?" I had no answer. I simply smiled, though the question echoed in my mind for weeks. But betrayal is a curious thing. It wounds, but it also awakens. Every rejection, every mockery, every moment of being sidelined hardened something inside me. What they saw as weakness, my silence, my endurance, was slowly transforming into strength. The more they ignored me, the more I began to pay attention to myself. The less they believed in me, the more I began to believe in the possibility that I could prove them wrong. There was one pivotal moment that crystallized this shift. It happened during a heated argument with my father. I had dared to suggest that I wanted to pursue a career path different from the stable one he had envisioned. His response was sharp, dismissive. "You will never succeed. You're not like your siblings. They have what it takes. You don't." His words should have shattered me. Instead, they ignited something I had never felt before. In that instant, I realized that his disbelief could either define me or drive me. I chose the latter. From then on, betrayal no longer felt like a chain. It became fuel. Every laugh at my expense became a reminder of the empire I would one day build. Every dismissal became a challenge I silently accepted. Every moment of invisibility became an opportunity to work in the shadows, where no one expected anything of me, giving me the freedom to prepare, to plan, to sharpen myself without scrutiny. Still, I would be lying if I said the pain disappeared. Nights were heavy with doubt. There were moments when I questioned my worth, when I wondered if I truly was the failure they believed me to be. But even in those darkest hours, I held on to a simple truth. Betrayal may wound deeply, but it also teaches resilience. If love and validation would not come from them, then I would learn to create it for myself. Looking back, I see that betrayal defined the contours of my identity. It showed me the raw, unfiltered truth of my place in the family. I was not the chosen one, not the favored one, not the one they boasted about. But in that role, the black sheep, the outsider, I found the freedom to become more than they ever imagined. They mocked me, sidelined me, ignored me, but in doing so, they unknowingly gave me the greatest gift, the fire to rise above them all. Betrayal had turned into resilience. Rejection had become fuel, and the black sheep was beginning to realize that one day, her shadows would cast a light so bright, even those who had dismissed her would not be able to look away. Dreams are fragile things when they are first born, soft whispers of possibility, easily crushed by the heavy footsteps of doubt. In my world, those footsteps belonged to my family. They ridiculed me so often that I began to hide my dreams as though they were contraband, something dangerous that might be snatched away or mocked into extinction. While my siblings lived in the glow of approval, I lived in shadows, clutching secret visions of a life far larger than the one laid out before me. From the outside, I looked like the obedient daughter, quiet and unremarkable. But inside I was building something invisible, an empire of imagination. I dreamed of independence, of creating something with my own hands that no one could take away. I dreamed of walking into rooms where my name carried weight, not because my family announced it, but because my work spoke louder than their silence ever could. These dreams were not loud, not flamboyant. They were quiet fires, flickering in the privacy of my heart. Every time I overheard an aunt say, "She will never amount to anything," I secretly pictured myself standing in front of a crowd, celebrated for accomplishments they could never have predicted. When cousins laughed at my awkwardness, I imagined a future where their laughter turned into awe. When my parents dismissed me with a wave of the hand, I nurtured visions of a life where I owed no one validation, where I stood tall because I had carved my own path. The contrast was painful, but sharp. At dinner tables, my siblings boasted about minor triumphs, soaking in the applause of relatives while I remained invisible. Yet, when I returned to my room at night, I opened notebooks where I had written goals, sketches of ideas, business plans scrawled in childish handwriting. They thought I was lost, drifting without purpose, but they had no idea how much clarity was taking root in my solitude. Of course, dreams without action are nothing more than fantasies. I knew I had to begin, even if my steps were small, even if failure was inevitable. And so I started. My first attempts were clumsy, trying to sell handmade crafts in local fairs, offering tutoring to younger children in the neighborhood, even drafting stories I hoped might one day be published. None of these ventures brought immediate success. Most ended in quiet disappointment. At the fair, people glanced past my stall without stopping. My tutoring income barely covered my notebooks and pens. My stories, when I sent them out, were rejected with cold form letters. To my family, these failures were proof of their beliefs. "Look at her," my brother laughed one evening. "Always chasing nonsense. She should focus on something real." My father shook his head, muttering, "Wasting time. She'll never learn." Their words stung, but they also clarified something within me. They didn't see my failures as steps. They saw them as confirmation of my weakness. But I knew differently. Failure was not an ending. It was a beginning disguised in rough clothing. I learned to embrace the invisibility they had forced upon me. If no one believed in me, then no one was watching closely enough to interfere. I could try, stumble, fall, and rise again without the burden of expectation. Every small attempt, though unseen, taught me something new. I learned how to speak to strangers at markets, how to manage small amounts of money, how to endure rejection without letting it crush me. My failures were not glamorous, but they were bricks in the foundation I was secretly laying. At times, the loneliness of this path threatened to suffocate me. There were nights when I sat in my room, staring at unfinished projects, wondering if they had been right all along, if I truly was destined for nothing. But then I would remember the image that fueled me, a life beyond the walls of my family's judgment, a life where I proved not just to them but to myself that I was capable. That vision pulled me forward, even when the road was steep. One evening stands out in my memory. After another harsh scolding from my father about my pointless pursuits, I sat in the backyard, staring at the night sky. The stars seemed impossibly far, yet they burned steadily, untouchable by the darkness around them. In that moment, I realized my dreams were like those stars, distant perhaps, but possible if I kept moving toward them. The ridicule of my family was noise. My dreams were direction. Over time, I grew comfortable with silence. I stopped trying to explain myself to them. I no longer sought their approval or defended my failures. Instead, I let my silence be my shield. They mistook it for surrender, believing I had given up. In reality, I was learning discipline. The discipline to keep going when no one clapped, when no one noticed, when no one believed. Looking back, those early attempts may seem insignificant compared to the empire I would eventually build. But they mattered. They mattered because they represented defiance against the odds stacked against me. They mattered because they taught me resilience, patience, and self-reliance. They mattered because they were mine, and no one could take them away. Dreams against the odds are not about instant victories. They are about quiet persistence, about holding on to a vision that no one else can see, about failing 1,000 times and still whispering, "Not yet, but one day." My family's ridicule did not kill my dreams. It fertilized them. Every insult, every dismissal, every laugh became water for the roots I was planting. They saw me as the black sheep, wandering aimlessly. But I knew I was building something invisible, something that would one day be undeniable. I carried my dreams like a secret weapon, hidden from their scorn, sharpened in silence. And though no one could see it then, those dreams were already reshaping my destiny. Loneliness has a way of amplifying every sound, every ticking clock, every whisper outside your door, every sigh that escapes your own lips. When I entered the loneliest chapter of my life, it was as though the world grew louder in its judgment and quieter in its support. Money slipped through my fingers like water. Friends who had once claimed to stand by me vanished the moment their presence required sacrifice. Relatives, who had already written me off, found fresh entertainment in my hardships. And my family, the people who should have been my foundation, called me a failure with such certainty that at times I almost believed them. I remember nights where hunger gnawed at me, not just in my stomach, but in my soul. Nights when I counted coins, not for luxuries, but to decide whether I could afford bread or bus fare the next morning. The simplicity of survival stripped me bare, forcing me to measure my worth not in grand dreams, but in the ability to endure one more day. My siblings flaunted their comforts, bought with either family's support or easy choices, while I scraped by on what little I could earn. Their lives seemed like feasts, while mine was an endless fast. The struggle was not only financial, it was emotional. Isolation wrapped around me like a cloak. Friends stopped answering calls, their excuses thin and predictable. "I'm busy. We'll catch up soon." Soon never came. They drifted away, carried by the current of convenience. Relatives whispered about me at family gatherings, not even bothering to lower their voices when I walked into the room. "She's wasting her life. She's going nowhere. Poor thing, she doesn't realize." Their pity was more poisonous than their insults. But perhaps the cruelest voices were the ones inside my own head. Every failure echoed louder when no one stood beside me. Every setback became a shadow that threatened to swallow my fragile light. There were nights when I cried into my pillow until exhaustion finally dragged me into sleep. And yet, no matter how deep the despair, a small flame refused to go out. I could not explain it, but I knew that giving up would be the true death of me. So I worked. I worked when no one believed in me, when no one applauded, when no one even noticed. I took odd jobs, cleaning, delivering, tutoring, anything that paid enough to keep the lights on. I learned to stretch a single meal into two, to make clothes last longer than they should, to walk instead of ride. Sacrifice became my silent companion. Each compromise, each hardship, was a thread that wove discipline into my life. Long nights became my training ground. While others slept, I studied. I read books I borrowed from libraries, hungrily devouring knowledge that might one day change my life. I scribbled ideas into worn notebooks, filling page after page with plans, strategies, visions of businesses I might one day build. The world outside saw a struggling failure. The world inside my mind saw blueprints of resilience. In those endless nights, creativity bloomed. With no resources, I learned to improvise. With no mentors, I became my own teacher. When one idea failed, I dissected it to understand why, then tried again. When rejection knocked me down, I stood back up, shaky but unwilling to stay fallen. Slowly, my scars began to harden into armor. Pain taught me patience. Isolation taught me focus. Lack taught me value. There was a strange paradox in my struggle. On one hand, I had never felt so invisible, so dismissed. On the other, I had never felt more alive, more determined. Every sneer, every rumor, every whispered insult fueled me in ways comfort never could. My family's certainty that I was a failure became the very challenge I lived to disprove. They wanted me broken, but their disbelief only sharpened me. I began to notice the seeds growing quietly in my life. Where once I had been impulsive, I was now disciplined. Where once I sought validation, I now sought progress. Where once I believed in luck, I now believed in persistence. I could not yet show the world what I was becoming, but I could feel it within me, taking root. There were days I wanted to scream at them all, at the family who dismissed me, at the friends who abandoned me, at the relatives who gossiped. I wanted to show them the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the silent wars I was fighting. But I learned to hold my silence. They would not understand. And perhaps they did not need to. One day, they would see without me having to explain. I lived through storms that seemed endless, but each storm carved me into something stronger. Poverty taught me resourcefulness. Loneliness taught me independence. Betrayal taught me self-reliance. Every tear watered the soil where resilience grew. And though no one applauded my struggle, though no one offered a hand, I knew that the greatest empires are built first in silence. The lonely struggle was not glamorous, not heroic in the ways stories are often told. It was raw, brutal, and exhausting. But it was also necessary. For it was in those nights of hunger, those days of ridicule, those years of invisibility that the foundation of my empire was laid. An empire not of castles and crowns, but of strength, discipline, and unshakable will. One day, I knew, the same voices that mocked me would change their tune. But until then, I carried on. Alone, yes, but not defeated. Because even in the deepest loneliness, I had discovered something no one could take from me. The resilience to keep walking, even when the road was nothing but shadow. The first signs of change came quietly, like whispers carried on the wind. There was no dramatic shift, no sudden fortune falling into my lap. Instead, it began with small, almost imperceptible victories, tiny sparks that hinted at a fire waiting to ignite. After years of scraping by, after nights of exhaustion and days of ridicule, I finally began to see proof that my persistence had not been in vain. It started with my work. The odd jobs I once took for survival had sharpened my skills in ways I hadn't expected. I had become resourceful, adaptable, relentless. One day, a client I worked for on a small freelance project referred me to someone else. That second opportunity paid better than anything I had earned before. The work was grueling, but when I received their words of praise, simple but genuine, I felt a rush I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, someone outside my family circle recognized my worth. Recognition, no matter how small, is intoxicating. It feeds the part of you that doubt tries to starve. Soon, another project came, and then another. Each task I completed taught me not just the skill of the trade, but the skill of belief. Slowly, I began to see that my vision was not foolish, that I was not condemned to failure. The world, beyond the walls of my family's judgment, had space for me to succeed. With each paycheck, however modest, I felt independence creeping into my life. I no longer had to count coins in quite the same desperate way. I could buy myself a proper meal without guilt. I could replace a pair of worn shoes instead of forcing them to last another season. These were not luxuries, they were milestones. Every little act of independence was proof that I was building something of my own. But family did not see it that way. They still looked at me through the same lens of skepticism. At gatherings, when others boasted about promotions, stable jobs, or marriages, I was met with dismissive smiles. "Still doing those little jobs?" they would ask, their words dipped in condescension. "That's nice, but when will you find something real?" Their disbelief was unwavering, almost rehearsed. They could not understand that the very foundation of what I was building was far sturdier than their hollow pride. Still, their doubt no longer cut as deeply as before. For every sneer I endured, I held a quiet counterweight, my victories. They were invisible to my family, but visible to me. And that was enough. The turning point came when I was invited to collaborate on a small project with people far outside my usual circle. They didn't know my past, my label as the family's black sheep, or the ridicule I carried like a scar. They only knew my work. And when that project succeeded, exceeding expectations and earning recognition for the entire team, I felt something shift inside me. For once, I wasn't the outcast or the failure. I was the person they looked to for ideas, for solutions, for leadership. That taste of respect was addictive. I wanted more, not out of vanity, but out of a hunger that had been denied for too long. I poured myself even deeper into my work, refining my craft, studying trends, learning strategies. Every mistake became a lesson, every rejection a stepping stone. My resilience, once born out of necessity, had now transformed into ambition. The victories were not yet grand enough to silence my family's doubt, but they were enough to transform me. I began to carry myself differently, not with arrogance, but with a quiet assurance. My conversations changed. My dreams no longer sounded like fantasies. They began to take the shape of plans. People outside my family noticed. A mentor figure, someone I met by chance, offered guidance. Their encouragement was unlike anything I had ever received at home. "You have potential," they said simply, "but you must believe in it before anyone else will." Those words became a mantra for me. Of course, there were still failures. Not every opportunity turned to gold. Some projects collapsed, some ideas flopped, and some doors remained firmly shut. But now failure no longer felt like the end. It felt like feedback. For the first time, I had the confidence to view setbacks not as evidence of my unworthiness, but as part of the process. That shift in mindset was a victory in itself. I began to imagine a life beyond survival. I could see glimmers of a future where I wasn't defined by rejection, but by achievement. My family still mocked me, still brushed off my progress, but their words began to lose their power. I no longer needed their validation. My victories, however small, were building a new narrative, one that belonged entirely to me. There is a sweetness to the first taste of freedom, especially when you've lived under the weight of dismissal. I would walk through the streets with my modest paycheck in my pocket and feel richer than anyone in my family's circle, because what I held was not money alone, it was proof. Proof that I was capable, proof that I was building, proof that I was no longer at the mercy of their judgment, and though I could not yet call it an empire, I knew I was laying its first stones. The sparks had been lit, and though they were small, they glowed with the promise of a fire that no amount of doubt could extinguish. This was only the beginning. The sparks of early victory soon became embers, and then a steady flame. What began as survival work, humble and overlooked, started to transform into something larger, something undeniable. It wasn't a sudden explosion of success. It was the slow, deliberate construction of an empire brick by brick. Discipline by discipline, decision by decision. I remember the first time I dared to call what I was doing a business. It sounded almost arrogant coming out of my mouth, as if I were overreaching. Yet deep down I knew that if I didn't treat it seriously, no one else ever would. So I gave it a name, however small. I drafted plans late into the night, charted out goals that seemed impossible, and began to see myself not as a struggler, but as a builder. That shift in self-image changed everything. Strategy became my weapon. I studied endlessly. Books, case studies, stories of self-made people who had built something from nothing. I dissected their failures and their successes, adapting what I could to my own path. I realized early on that talent and effort were important, but without vision and direction, they scattered like dust in the wind. So I crafted a vision, not just to earn, but to expand, to create, to dominate the very spaces where I had once been dismissed. Hard work became my constant companion. There were weeks when I slept only a handful of hours each night, consumed by the demands of growth. Orders had to be fulfilled, clients had to be satisfied, and opportunities had to be seized before they slipped away. I became both the architect and the laborer of my dreams, designing strategies on paper and then working tirelessly to bring them to life. There was no safety net, no applause, no support system. Just me, my ambition, and an unshakable refusal to quit. And yet, it wasn't all sweat and sacrifice. There were triumphs, tangible, undeniable triumphs, that proved my work was paying off. The business began to grow steadily. What was once one client became 5. What was once a modest income doubled, then tripled. Word of mouth spread, not because of luck, but because of consistency. I delivered more than I promised, and in a world where mediocrity often passes as acceptable, that became my edge. Slowly, a brand began to form. It wasn't just a business anymore. It had an identity, a presence, a reputation. People began to associate my name with reliability, with excellence, with results. The same family that had once laughed at me for doing little jobs now began to overhear others mention me with respect. Strangers saw what they could not. The black sheep had teeth, and it was carving a place in the world that no one could ignore. Expansion followed. I reinvested every cent I could, refusing to indulge in luxuries until the foundation was unshakable. Where others my age spent weekends in leisure, I spent mine in planning, networking, experimenting. Each calculated risk brought me closer to dominance. I hired my first team member, a decision both terrifying and exhilarating. Trusting someone else with even a fragment of my vision felt like handing over a piece of my heart. But it was necessary, because growth could no longer be managed by my 2 hands alone. And as the company grew, so did I. The survival-driven individual who once begged the world for scraps evolved into a leader. I learned how to delegate, how to inspire, how to see potential in others the way no one had ever seen it in me. My voice, once silenced by ridicule, became one that others listened to, sought guidance from. I began to walk into rooms not as an outsider desperate to prove my worth, but as someone who had already proven it. The irony was delicious. The very traits my family mocked, the stubbornness, the refusal to conform, the audacity to dream differently, were the same traits fueling my empire. Where they saw defiance, the world saw innovation. Where they saw foolishness, clients saw boldness. Where they dismissed me, investors saw potential. Everything they tried to suffocate had become the engine of my rise. But building an empire wasn't just about money or recognition. It was about rewriting my story. Every new contract, every expansion, every milestone was a rebuke to the voices that once told me I wasn't enough. It was proof that the black sheep could not only survive but thrive, and lead the entire herd if it chose to. Of course, success did not silence every challenge. Growth brought pressure. Mistakes were magnified, competition grew sharper, and responsibility weighed heavily. Yet these challenges no longer frightened me. After enduring years of rejection, what was a delayed payment compared to that? After surviving betrayal, what was the sting of a failed project? I had been hardened in the shadows of my family's neglect. Now I was sharpened in the fires of success. There came a day when the numbers spoke louder than any opinion. My revenue surpassed the salaries of those same relatives who once flaunted their stability. The brand I built began to reach markets they had never dreamed of. And with each achievement, whispers spread. This time not of pity or mockery, but of awe. The black sheep was building an empire, and no one could deny it anymore. And yet, I did not gloat. I did not rush to flaunt my success at family dinners or wave my accomplishments in their faces. My silence was intentional, my dignity deliberate. Because the greatest power was not in proving them wrong, it was in showing the world, and myself, that I never needed their approval to begin with. I was not the same person they had branded years ago. I was no longer fighting just to survive. I was leading, creating, expanding. I was stepping into a destiny so much larger than their limited imagination could contain. And as I stood on the growing foundation of my empire, I realized something profound. I had never been the black sheep at all. I had simply been the one who refused to be ordinary, and now the empire was the proof. There comes a moment in every journey when the tides shift, when the same voices that once hurled ridicule begin to whisper differently. For me, that moment arrived quietly, without fanfare or announcement. It wasn't one grand event, but a slow, steady change in the way people looked at me, in the way they spoke my name. The black sheep, once dismissed, was now someone they had to reckon with. I first noticed it in the smallest of gestures. A relative who once smirked at my struggles now asked casually what I had been working on lately. His tone wasn't mocking anymore. It was cautious, almost careful, as if testing the waters. I smiled politely, answering without pride or bitterness. Inside, I remembered every dismissive laugh, every word that had branded me a failure. But I did not voice it. My silence carried more weight than any reminder ever could. Soon, the whispers began. I heard them when I entered a room, when I walked past clusters of relatives at gatherings. They spoke of me now with curiosity, sometimes with thinly veiled envy. Did you hear about the contracts? They say the business is doing well. I always knew there was potential there. The hypocrisy was sharp, almost laughable. These were the same people who had once called my dreams foolish, who had rolled their eyes at my determination. Now, they tried to rewrite history, painting themselves as the ones who had always believed. Society, too, shifted in its gaze. Strangers respected what family had overlooked. Opportunities flowed more easily. Doors that had once been locked tight began to open. Invitations arrived, seminars, conferences, collaborations, spaces where my name was spoken with admiration. Yet, at the core of it all, I remained grounded, remembering vividly the years when my worth was invisible. Success had changed their perception, not my identity. The family dinners, once arenas of humiliation, transformed into subtle stages of recognition. The relatives who used to boast about their children's stable jobs now stumbled to include me in conversations, as though they feared being left out of my narrative. "You should ask for advice," one would say to another, nudging their son or daughter toward me. I would listen, nod, and respond kindly, but deep inside, I felt the sharp contrast of then and now. There was no gloating on my part. I had no need to rub salt into old wounds. Their own silence, their own awkward shifts of tone, carried the weight of the reckoning. I had learned that true victory was not in shouting from rooftops, but in standing calmly while others choked on their own regrets. Still, there were moments that pierced me, not with pain, but with a bittersweet ache. My mind would drift back to the years of isolation, to the countless nights when I worked alone, unrecognized, mocked for trying. I remembered how they had once branded me a disappointment, and I realized that no amount of admiration now could erase the scars of those days. Success could change their perception, but it could not undo the past. And perhaps it was better that way. Those scars had become my armor, reminders of why I refused to quit. The envy grew thicker as my empire expanded. Some tried to mask it with forced smiles, others with shallow compliments. But envy has a way of slipping through even the most polished expressions. I could see it in their eyes, the way they measured me now, the way their words trembled with the weight of comparison. And I, once the black sheep, stood steady, neither basking in their envy nor shrinking from it. I had become untouchable, not because of arrogance, but because I had risen beyond their judgment. Irony became my silent companion. The same relatives who had told me to be realistic now sought validation in my achievements. They wanted to claim association, to polish their own image by aligning with mine. "That's my cousin," one would say proudly to an outsider. "We always knew they had something special," another would whisper. I heard these words with a calm detachment, knowing full well they were rewriting the script to suit themselves. But the greatest transformation wasn't in their behavior. It was in me. Where once I had craved their approval, now I stood indifferent to it. Their admiration no longer fed me, and their envy no longer wounded me. I had transcended both. My validation came not from their shifting opinions, but from the empire I had built with my own hands. The very fire they tried to extinguish had burned brighter than ever, illuminating a path they could no longer deny existed. This turning point was less about recognition and more about reclamation. It was about taking back the narrative they had tried to force upon me. They had branded me the black sheep, but I had carved my own identity: leader, creator, builder. Their labels no longer defined me. My achievements did. At times I wondered if forgiveness was possible. Not the kind of forgiveness that excuses betrayal, but the kind that releases its hold on your spirit. I chose to let go, not for them, but for myself. Holding on to bitterness would have meant chaining myself to the very past I had outgrown. And so, when they came with cautious praise, I accepted it with grace. Not because they deserved it, but because I no longer needed their validation to stand tall. The turning point was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost serene. It was in the way I carried myself into a room, the way I no longer shrank under their gaze. It was in the silence I held when they stumbled to acknowledge me, the silence that echoed louder than words. It was in the calmness that came from knowing that the empire I had built could not be diminished by anyone's envy or hypocrisy. This was the contrast. The same family that once mocked me now sought to stand beside me. The same society that once overlooked me now admired me. And I, who had once longed for their approval, now stood unshaken, detached, and free. The black sheep had turned the page. And though the past could never be erased, the present carried its own undeniable truth. I was no longer defined by rejection. I was defined by what I had built, and no whisper, whether envious or admiring, could change that. The turning point wasn't just in how they saw me. It was in how I saw myself. It was a night stitched together with elegance. The chandeliers dripped golden light across polished marble floors, and the hall buzzed with the murmur of relatives, family friends, and old acquaintances. It was one of those grand gatherings where everyone tried to outshine one another with clothes, jewelry, and gossip. Once upon a time, I would have dreaded such nights, walking in with the weight of pity clinging to me, branded the black sheep, the one they whispered about with smirks and sideways glances. But tonight was different. Tonight I wasn't arriving as the abandoned, overlooked child of the family. I was arriving as the builder of an empire. The whispers began the moment I stepped into the room. Heads turned, conversations faltered, and I could feel eyes clinging to me. Not with ridicule this time, but with curiosity, envy, and disbelief. My presence demanded attention without me uttering a single word. I walked with quiet dignity, not flaunting, not rushing, but steady, each step a reminder that the person they had dismissed had risen higher than they could have imagined. I could see the faces of those who had once mocked me, their expressions caught between forced smiles and unspoken regret. The aunts who had ridiculed my failures, the uncles who had boasted of their own children's success, the cousins who had laughed behind my back, all of them now shifted uneasily in their seats. The hall, so full of chatter a moment ago, seemed to soften into a muted hum, as if my very presence had changed the rhythm of the night. The irony was sharp, almost poetic. Years ago, I had been the one shrinking into corners, clutching at the edges of conversations I was never truly welcomed into. Tonight, I stood at the center without trying, without asking. The contrast was unbearable for them, but liberating for me. I noticed my parents first. Once, their pride had rested on others, on siblings who they believed carried the family's honor better than I could. Tonight, their eyes carried something different. Hesitation, perhaps even shame. They could not meet my gaze at first, as though the weight of their own misjudgments pressed down on them. My father cleared his throat, attempting a smile that looked more like a grimace. My mother busied herself with arranging her shawl, avoiding the moment entirely. Their silence spoke volumes, but the true reckoning was not in their silence, it was in the way everyone else responded. Those who had once dismissed me now stumbled over their words, trying to weave themselves into my story. "We always knew you had something in you," one uncle said, his voice shaky, betraying the falseness of the claim. Another relative leaned in, whispering, "You've done so well for yourself." "We're all proud." The hypocrisy was suffocating, yet I met it with calm indifference. They had not built me, they had not believed in me, and their pride now was only a reflection of their regret. Cousins who had once been paraded as the family's shining stars stood quietly, their accomplishments paling in the shadow of my empire. I could see the discomfort in their eyes, the way they avoided meeting mine, the way their laughter seemed forced, brittle. The stage they had once dominated had shifted beneath their feet, and they were left clinging to remnants of attention that no longer belonged to them. What struck me most was the reversal of roles. The humiliation they had once placed upon me now mirrored back onto them. I did not need to raise my voice, did not need to point out the hypocrisy. They felt it in the silence that stretched between us. Every forced smile, every awkward compliment was a confession, a quiet acknowledgement that they had been wrong. I wandered through the hall, exchanging polite greetings, offering nods and small smiles. My calmness was the loudest response I could have given. I did not need to gloat. My presence alone was a reckoning. The empire I had built spoke louder than words, louder than any revenge I could have orchestrated. They had left me in the ashes, and I had built a kingdom from it. At one point, I found myself near a group of relatives who were whispering. They fell silent the moment I approached, their eyes darting nervously. One of them finally spoke, her voice trembling. "It's inspiring what you've done, truly inspiring." I thanked her softly, but inside I remembered how the same lips had once called me a disappointment. The memory did not sting, it empowered me. For the first time, I understood the depth of transformation. They had tried to bury me, but I had grown roots they could not see, and now I towered above them. The conversations that night were laced with contrast. They asked questions about my business, about my journey, about the future. But beneath their words, I could hear the undertone of regret. Regret that they had not supported me. Regret that they had underestimated me. Regret that they had invested their pride elsewhere. It wasn't admiration they carried. It was a desperate attempt to reconcile their past judgments with my present reality. My siblings, too, stood quietly on the sidelines. Once they had basked in the attention, celebrated as the golden children. Now their silence was heavy, their expressions clouded with resentment and discomfort. I did not seek revenge in their eyes, but I saw the weight of comparison pressing down on them, a weight they had never carried before. They had been given everything while I had been given nothing. Yet it was I who had built something from that nothing. That truth, unspoken, was the reckoning. The moment reached its peak when a distant relative raised a toast. His voice boomed through the hall as he praised hard work, resilience, and success. Though he did not mention my name, every gaze turned toward me, every eye acknowledged the unspoken truth. The toast was mine, even if they lacked the courage to say it. As glasses clinked and the hall echoed with forced cheer, I stood still, letting the weight of the moment sink in. This was not about revenge. It was not about proving them wrong. It was about finally standing in my truth, unshaken, undeniable. They had once defined me as the black sheep, but tonight, their own pride collapsed into silence and regret. And I carried no bitterness, no desire to wound them as they had once wounded me. My reckoning was not their humiliation, it was my peace. It was the knowledge that I had risen beyond their labels, beyond their gossip, beyond their narrow vision of who I could be. As the night drew on, I stepped outside for a moment, away from the noise and the whispers. The air was cool, the sky stretched wide above me. For the first time at such a gathering, I felt light, free. The reckoning had arrived, not with fire or fury, but with calm inevitability. They had written me off. I had rewritten myself. Inside, the music played, the voices carried on, but the story had already changed forever. The black sheep had become the empire builder, and no one in that hall could deny it. There are moments in life when silence speaks louder than applause. When I look back on my journey, I do not hear the echoes of mockery anymore, nor the sting of laughter that once pierced through me like knives. What I hear instead is the steady rhythm of resilience, the quiet beat of persistence that carried me through nights of despair, through years of rejection, through the loneliness of being branded the black sheep. That rhythm, steady and unwavering, became my foundation. It was never about the noise others made. It was always about the strength I built in the silence they left me with. I used to think betrayal defined me. That being overlooked by my parents, mocked by relatives, dismissed by siblings, and abandoned by those I loved most would forever shape my identity. But life has a way of reshaping its wounds into wisdom. What once felt like an ending was nothing more than a beginning in disguise. They had given me pain, but that pain was raw material, a forge in which resilience was born, a fire in which strength was tempered. Looking back, I see now that every cruel word was a lesson, every rejection a spark, every betrayal a chisel carving me into who I was meant to become. My empire was not built on gold or privilege, it was built on scars. Scars that healed into maps guiding me forward. Scars that reminded me that even broken things can rise, and sometimes it is the broken who rise the highest. When my family labeled me the black sheep, they believed they had named my fate. They thought they had confined me to a life of failure, of wandering shadows, of always being less than the rest. But they failed to see that names hold no power unless you surrender to them. I took the name they gave me and turned it into fuel. They thought they had buried me under shame, but they had only planted me. And from that soil I grew, not quietly, not invisibly, but into a presence they could no longer deny. The empire I built was never about wealth alone. Yes, there was money, success, recognition, but these were only the surface. Beneath it all lay something deeper, dignity. True dignity, the kind that is not bought, not borrowed, not handed down through family pride, the kind that is earned piece by piece through sacrifice, through persistence, through refusal to collapse. That dignity became my crown, invisible yet undeniable. And when I finally stood in the very rooms where I had once been humiliated, something extraordinary happened. I felt no need to gloat, no desire to wound them with reminders of their cruelty. Their regret was their own, not my responsibility. My triumph did not need their validation. It already existed full and complete, long before they ever admitted it. That was when I understood. Revenge is hollow when it relies on someone else's downfall. The sweetest revenge is not proving them wrong. It is proving yourself right. My story is not just mine. It belongs to anyone who has ever been underestimated, overlooked, dismissed, or betrayed. To anyone who has sat at family dinners in silence, enduring comparisons that cut deep. To anyone who has walked through gossip, whispers, and ridicule, wondering if they would ever escape the cage of others' expectations. To you, I say this: your story is not over. Betrayal may wound you, rejection may scar you, but neither has the power to define you, unless you let it. The path from black sheep to empire builder is not glamorous. It is not a story of instant victories or dramatic rescues. It is built in lonely nights where no one claps for you, in mornings when giving up feels easier than moving forward, in sacrifices that no one else will ever see. But those hidden moments, those invisible battles, are where true strength is born. And one day, that strength will bring you to places where even your silence commands respect. I used to crave their approval. I used to ache for my parents to see me, for relatives to acknowledge me, for friends to stand beside me. But now I carry something far greater, the knowledge that I never needed them to validate my worth. My worth was never theirs to give, it was mine to claim. And in claiming it, I discovered freedom. Freedom to create, to build, to rise, without their permission, without their applause. Today, when I walk into those same gatherings, I no longer shrink. I no longer search for eyes that might recognize me. Instead, I carry my own recognition, my own pride, my own peace. They see me now, yes. They whisper in awe. They speak my name with admiration. They rewrite the narrative they once twisted. But all of that matters less than the simple truth that I no longer need it. The legacy I leave behind is not in the empire itself, but in the journey. In the proof that scars can be turned into stepping stones. In the reminder that humiliation is not permanent. In the lesson that silence, when embraced with discipline, can become strategy. That is the legacy I want others to inherit. Not my wealth, not my success, but my belief that no betrayal has the final word. And so I stand here now, at the close of this chapter, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Grateful for the betrayal that tested me. Grateful for the silence that forced me to listen to myself. Grateful for the rejection that freed me from dependence. Without them, I might never have built what I have today. My parents, my relatives, my siblings, they all became part of the story, but not the end of it. Their labels, their dismissals, their judgments were chapters, not conclusions. The conclusion was mine to write, and I wrote it not with ink, but with resilience. To anyone listening, remember this. People may strip you of opportunities, may laugh at your failures, may brand you with names that burn. But what they cannot take from you is will. Will to endure, to persist, to rise. Guard it, nurture it, wield it, and it will carry you further than their approval ever could. My closure is simple. They gave me betrayal. I turned it into resilience. They gave me silence. I turned it into strength. They gave me rejection. I turned it into an empire. That is my story, my legacy, my truth. And if there is one final lesson I can leave behind, let it be this. The greatest revenge is not proving them wrong. It is proving yourself right.